Maybe when you're tempted, the words come back to your mind, thou shalt not. But is it a relationship with you? God promises that someday he's going to put his laws into our hearts. They will become part of our character. And I believe he begins that process when you give your heart, your life to him, when you surrender your life to him, when you are born again through the Spirit and through the water of baptism. But we're in a world today that really does not give a hoot about God's commandments. We've been looking at the Ten Commandments through the filter of the children of Israel. We're going to walk that journey in another step this morning. But the commandments we're going to look at this morning deal with the very heart of where we're going as a nation and as a people and as a planet. We've been looking at the relationship with God and his people, and we looked last week at the relationship you have with your parents, those that God has called to lead you spiritually, and now he walks one step further. These commandments we're going to look at this morning, they get a lot of negative press because they're kind of a downer. Do not, do not, do not. You know, who wants to hear that, really? I believe God wants us to do, enjoy, live. And this says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal. Why does he say these things? If you start to look at the relationship portion of the commandments, you realize that this is more than just about how you treat your brothers and sisters. These commandments were put in place not only to help us guard our relationships with each other, it's to help us guard our relationship with God. The Israelite nation has come out of bondage, they've come out of slavery, they've come out of horrific circumstances, and they just need to learn how to be a nation. And let's be honest, if you were in bondage for 400 years, what do you think your life would be like? 400 years, all you've known is that your family served another kingdom and that you were their slaves. You had few rights, few privileges, few benefits. This is all you knew, and you knew that your worth was that of a slave. A lot can happen in 400 years. From the time that Joseph went down to Egypt and was blessed by God to lead that nation out of famine, and Pharaoh blessed his family, and his family came and was fruitful and multiplied and were treated as celebrities in the land. But over time, things changed. What could really happen in 400 years? In 1776, this nation became a nation. We have a declaration of independence that we proclaimed as a nation. And in a little over 200 years, what in the world has happened to our nation? I could say in a little over 50 years, what has happened to our nation? In a little over 20 years, what has happened to our nation? In a little over just 10 years, what has happened to our nation? As we look through the story of what's going on in Israel, I hope we look through the story of what's going on in our life. The children of Israel have been brought to the mountain of God. God is speaking his commandments, his laws. They hear his voice echoing across that valley. My dear wife and I had the privilege of going down to the place which is known to be Mount Sinai. 2:00 in the morning, we got on a camel and we rode up to the top of that. Well, at least as far as we could ride. We hiked some. We took the camel some. Only because they wanted us to see the sunrise at the top of the mountain at 6 a.m. Our whole group was there. Well, most of us were there. About 3/4 of the way up the mountain, we stopped, and there the Bedouins had a nice little tent set up, and you went inside. It was cold. At that elevation in the morning, it's extremely cold. You're in the 30s degrees. We were not fully prepared for this adventure, even though knew we were going to go. And so they have a tent that you go inside and you sit around hay bales around the tent. The tent is illuminated with candles, and they serve you things like, well, coffee and candy bars, chocolate. My wife and I, in preparing for this journey, I told her, we're going to be back by 8 o'clock. We eat breakfast and we really don't need any extra food. Foolish me. We had walked, we had hiked, we hadn't eaten breakfast, and by the time we were about 5 a.m., we were hungry, we were tired, low of energy, your blood sugar has dropped, and you know, a Snicker bar never tasted better. The last portion of the journey is 700 steps you walk up. Doesn't sound like a lot, does it? When you figure about 14 steps per flight for every floor that you go, multiply that out, you're like going up 70-something flights of stairs. About 2/3 of the way up, my heart is beating, the head is light. I see people going faint, throwing up along the way, getting sick, and I'm thinking, God, if I just make it up here, let me die at least at the top. We weren't prepared. But as the sun came up and we looked across that valley, and you could see the view that Moses would have had in the very presence of God, and you realize he's looking down to see a people that God has brought out of bondage, a people that God has brought out of slavery, a people that God has brought to himself to be a nation. And God's only desire for them is to be fruitful, to multiply, and to bless them. And while they're up on the mountain, their true character comes out. It's easy to follow God when you see the miracles. Can you say amen to that? It's easy to follow God when things are going well. And it's easy to doubt God when they're not. In case we're going to beat up the Israelites too much, we're going to put ourselves in their place for a few moments here. When they came out of Egypt, they were being pursued by an enemy that wanted to destroy them, and they were defenseless. When they came up to the border of the Red Sea, that enemy was getting closer and closer. Their only dependence was on God. Everything seemed to be about to crumble before them. Their lives seemed to be snuffed out. And God steps in, opens a way, and they parts the sea, and they walk through, leaving behind them their enemy dead on the shore as the waters came in and destroyed their destroyers. But they were still slaves. They were praising God. They sang the song of Moses and the Lamb. They praised with Mary and praising God for the horse and the rider is thrown in the sea. But in their hearts, they're still slaves. And they come to the mountain of God, and God wants to set before them his beauty of his government that's going to rule them. He's going to be their God, their king, their leader. He's going to guide them, protect them, care for them every step of the way. But in their hearts, they're still slaves. And now Moses goes up to the mountain, and they're hearing God's voice speak his law to them. And when he's all done, the people say, yes, all that God says we will do. We follow him. We trust him. He is an amazing God. He saves his people, and all of their praise is being offered to God until they can't see their leader anymore. It's amazing how fickle we are as a people. It's amazing how we will shift from our allegiance from one side to the next, back and forth. It doesn't take much. It just takes a charismatic person to lead us that way. We are almost like lemmings. You know, you ever see the movie The Flight of the Lemmings? It's kind of a tragic story, but there they are, the little lemmings following their leader, and they make their way across the ground, and you'll see them. They're running, these little guys, and they're really cute, and they're running fast, fast, fast. And there's like a whole herd of them. They're just going nowhere, and you just don't know exactly what they're doing, but it's really cute to see them run. They're destined to get to their destination until you realize their destination is their final end. Their leader leads them off the cliff, and you watch all these little guys, and they're just falling off the cliff, and they're all perishing down into the waters. I believe our world today is following this in many respects. Because we've turned our allegiance away from God, we are looking for people amongst us to lead us. Israel will get to that place. We'll see this here in a moment. They're looking for some physical, visible sign. Their faith is not strong enough yet in their God. Their belief in him is not totally grounded in his power and his word and who he says. Even though they says, we'll follow you. Even though they say, we will be faithful to you. Moses is gone a little too long. As the saying goes, when the cat's away, the mice will play. And so they become restless. They want to get to the promised land. They want to be done with this. They want to get to their place of their final inheritance. They're ready to be there. I don't know about you, but I've been hearing about going home for all my life. And if you're younger than me, you've been hearing about it all of your life. And if you're older than me, you've been hearing about it all of your life. And your parents probably told it to you. And it's been a story we've been hearing going down through the ages as long as time has lasted, or at least since Jesus came to this earth. And we've been hearing that he's coming back soon. That he's going to take us home. And that this whole trouble is going to end. And yet we're still here. Are you getting restless? Our nation is restless right now. We have ideologies that are warring together. Our planet is restless right now. People are wanting safety among fears of pandemics. We have people who are wanting prosperity as markets are in question. We see nations like China that are locking down their people, persecuting Christians. We see everything is coming to some kind of climatic, battle. It's hard to believe that you could be in the very presence of God and yet still do what these people did. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 32. Exodus chapter 32 depicts what's going on in their experience. They've been waiting for Moses. And you begin in verse 31 of Exodus chapter, verse 1, of Exodus chapter 32, and we see what's taking place. Tells us when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. I don't know what their expectations were. I don't know what their belief was. I guess they thought Moses was just going to go up there, get the law, come back down. It would all be done in a few days. They'd be moving on. But apparently he's gone a long time. They know what kind of food he took with him. They know what kind of resources he had. They're thinking, this fellow Moses, he's gone up. He's brought us out of Egypt, but we're not seeing him. And so they go to Aaron. They say, Aaron, we need something different here. Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. It's kind of interesting to believe that they could see the power of God to sustain them. Water from the rock, manna on the ground every morning, the water that the Red Sea parted, that God saved them, all of these things. And yet somehow they believe that while they see God's presence on the mountain, that somehow Moses is in that presence and Moses perishes in the presence of God. Doesn't make sense, does it? From our perspective, thousands of years later, we look at the story and go, what's wrong with these people? Well, we have 20/20 hindsight. We got that vantage point, but the question we have to ask ourselves, is my faith like this too? Have I been waiting so long that I no longer believe that Jesus is coming? That it's coming as soon? The answer to that question really goes to how I live my life. Do I live my life in expectancy that Jesus is coming soon? Are they living their life in expectancy that they're going to make it into the promised land? Well, this is where the story gets to be very difficult because it's hard to understand how Aaron does what he does, but there it is. It's on record. Aaron tells them, take your earrings off, give them to me. I'm going to make you a God-shaped calf. I'm going to provide for you what you're asking. I'm going to do for you what you believe you need. And this is where the story gets a little bit closer to home. We're living in a time where people are asking for things that they think they want, they think they need, but is God in that? Is God in that? Aaron makes the calf, and it's preposterous what he says. It's blasphemous what he says. He says, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Tomorrow we'll have a festival to the Lord. It's baptizing their sinful ideology, as it were. It's saying, this is what's going to represent the God who brought you out of Egypt, and tomorrow we will baptize this as holy. We will say, this is what's going to save us. This is what's going to be your God. This is what brought you out of Egypt. One of the difficulties we're facing in our world in the Christian sense is, how do we all come together on what's true? When our leaders are not following what is true. The command we're going to look at here for a moment is, you should not commit adultery. When you look at these commandments and you think about it, well, adultery, we know what's happening between, men and women, that we get that. You're married, you don't have those relations with someone who's not your spouse, but it goes much further than that. Actually, in the original language, adultery actually means infidelity, but it can mean infidelity to God, to be unfaithful to God. They're about ready to be unfaithful to their God. So when God is speaking these commandments to his people, he's not only speaking about their relationship with themselves, he's speaking about their relationship with him. Are you going to be faithful to me as your God? Yes, we will. I believe before anyone commits the act of adultery, they have committed the act of spiritual adultery. They've distanced themselves from God first. My wife shared with me a story this past week that kind of makes you shake your head. I question whether I would share it with you, but here it goes. We're talking about this commandment. So there's a ministerial couple, part of what I understand, probably a fairly prosperous denomination, church. Husband finds out, I believe, the wife is having an affair, and the spouses get together and say, well, as long as they're going to do that, why don't we all just, join together and make this a bigger experience? We'll just put it that way. Didn't stop there. And they started looking around the community of the church believers and seeing who else they could bring into their newfound relationship. I'm trying to be very sanitize this because you sit there and shake your head. It doesn't stop there, because now that it's found out and the person loses their ministry, they want to come back and still maintain their leadership role in the community. The pastor who is sleeping with other women in the community, the pastor's wife who is sleeping with other men in the church, want to still lead the church. And you shake your head and go, how could this even be a discussion? How could we even get to this place? But the reality is, friends, we've gotten so far off base that anything sounds reasonable today. People will believe anything because they're emotionally tied to the person that is, they believe, leading them. Aaron said it. Take your earrings off. I'll make a God that will be the one that will lead you out of Egypt. You can believe this God. You can follow this God. Out of your ears, off of your nose ring, wherever that jewelry came, kind of disgusting when we think about that, I will make a God that somehow you will look at and go, praise this God. This is a God I can follow. This is a God I can worship. This is the God who led me out of bondage. It makes no sense to a mind that is not spiritually darkened. But to get to this place, they had to have finally listened to someone. You can imagine what's going on in the camp. Moses is gone. A few days he's gone. Boy, he'll get back. We can go on to Egypt. A week it's gone. Boy, I wish he'd get back sooner, you know? I'm ready to go. 2 weeks? You think something happens to Moses? You think he's okay up there? Well, you can still see God's presence. I'm sure he's okay. 3 weeks? Who's gone that long without food? Boy, you're going to lose a lot of weight if you don't eat for 3 weeks. Yeah, I know. It happened to me last year. 4 weeks? 5 weeks? And Moses isn't back? Moses, he must be dead. No one's gone that long. Aaron, we need a Savior. Help us. Their whole mind starts to become twisted because their reality, their belief in God is based on an experience they don't yet have. They do not truly know God the way that they should know him. Coming out of bondage, they've been exposed to things that are of a spiritualistic nature that is ultimately destroying their spiritual belief. And this is where we are in our world today. There is so many things that are bombarding us outside of God's truth that we are starting to believe that somehow this word can be filtered through the lie of what's out there. We were talking on the way down this morning, before we had our nice little detour in Basin, watching the parade. It's interesting to be part of a parade. We've never been part of a parade before. You wave to the people, you know? What do you do? Nobody came and got candy, gave us candy. But anyway, we were talking on the way down, and the truth of the matter is there are people who are looking at this word, people who used to trust this word, people who believe this word, people who follow this word, and now the reality is they are listening to the lie of sophistry of those who are against this word, and the very foundation of this word is being questioned now. The very truth of our God as creator is being denied now. The Israelite people saw it. They heard his voice. They knew his power, and yet they're denying who he is. If it can happen to us, it could certainly happen to them. Or if it happened to them, it could happen to us. If they, in the very presence of God, could be deceived to believe that this calf that came out of their earrings could lead them out of Egypt, that would be the one to lead them to the promised land, if they could believe that, do you think it's possible for us to believe lies too? Of course it is. We're seeing it happen. Well, you know what happens in the story? They proclaim a festival to God. They offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. They present this to their calf god. This is the one that represents the God who brought us out of Egypt. And then they sit down, they eat, drink, and they indulge in revelry. You know, the nations that they're going to go into, this is how they worship. The nations that they are going to occupy, that ultimately God is going to give to them because these nations are in apostasy, this is how they worship. The revelry that takes place here is only because they have seen and been exposed to it in Egypt, and somehow they think that they can bring that into their worship of the living God, and they're deceived. We have to be very careful when we look at what's acceptable to our God. We have to be very careful when we think about what it is that God is calling us to do. The very first thing that leads them into bondage or from bondage into spiritual bondage or greater bondage is the fact that they are turning away from the truth that's in God's commandments, his word. Our next command we're going to look at very quickly for a moment is, you shall not steal. You kind of wonder because these people are out there in the wilderness and they really don't have a lot of, wealth yet. They've been given some blessings or some wealth from the Egyptians. They have some gold, some earrings and things that they have given to the temple of God, but is stealing really a big temptation for them? You know, it's like, what do they need to know? When you think of stealing, it's just stealing an object that belongs to someone else. Well, that's far different than what it has when it respects to our relationship to God. Children of Israel go on from the Mount Sinai, and they make their way, just in a very short period of time, they make their way to the border of the promised land. And they send out the spies. In fact, if you want to follow the story, you can look there in Numbers chapter 14. Let's just hang on to that place for a moment. Numbers chapter 14, God tells Moses, send some men into the land to explore the land in verse 13 that I'm going to give to Israel. So they call from each tribe, they bring a representative, someone who is going to go and to look into the land and to kind of evaluate what it is they're going to receive. And of course, you know the story. The spies go in and they come out. And there they are, two guys. If you've ever read Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories or the stories about the children of Israel, you've seen the picture. There they are, these guys, and they've got this bunch of grapes between them. And these grapes are like the size of, cantaloupes. And they're just tremendous in size. And you're thinking, man, what it would be like to have grapes like that? I love grapes. And they're green grapes, too. Those are really good. How awesome would that be? They brought the fruit of the land out. And when the people see this, they get excited. This is just amazing. This is what the land has got to offer us. Look what we're going to have. Let's go get it. But they don't stay there. In fact, if you go through the story, you see that the whole shift begins to turn. Verse 27 tells us they give Moses an account of the land that's flowing with milk and honey. Here is fruit. And the people who live there, though, here's where it starts to become a little bit challenging. The people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified, very large. And we even saw the descendants of Anak, verse 28. The Amalekites live there in the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill city, and the Canaanites live near the sea. They saw it all along the Jordan. And then Caleb says, hey, wait a minute. Let's go now. Let's go up. Let's take the land. Let's possess it. This is the truth. And everyone believed them, and they all followed in. God led them into the promised land, and they are there to this day. Not true, is it? It's not how it works. Not how the story went. 10 spies came back, and they said, you know what? We were like grasshoppers in the sight of the Anakim. We're not going to be able to do this. Let us go back. It's too difficult. It's too hard. God can't take us there is what they're saying. And you sit there and you think about the story because you've just been reading through the Exodus account and you're in Numbers, and maybe it's only taken you a few days to get here since you started in Exodus. You are now reading Numbers, and you've been studying this as part of your devotional. And you start reading this account and you go, wait a minute. These are the people that came to the Red Sea. These are the people who watched the 10 plagues. These are the people who saw the manna on the ground. These are the people who heard God's voice on the mountain. These are the people who realized, oops, we can't worship the golden calf. That's not working. These are the people who are actually going into the promised land, led by God, led by Moses. These are the people who are going to inherit the promised land, and then all of a sudden, did they face an obstacle here? Were there enemies lined up at the border? Did they see them standing there with spears and swords, daring them to come in? We will execute all of you across this line. None of that. They heard a lie, and they believed a lie. They're too big. They're too tough. We are grasshoppers. They're giants. If you go there, you're going to be wiped out. We're living at a time right now where people's faith is being tested. people's faith is being tried in a way that it's never been tried before. I will say it this way, because I've talked with a number of people who are fearful of what is going on in our world today. Fearful as they see the government doing things that they believe are not constitutional, that somehow that the force that the government is pushing is going to bring them to a place of destruction. I will be honest and say I don't know how things are going to turn out. We live in a world that is, at least here in the United States, is in fast turning around. Our value systems are changing quickly. It seems that our Constitution is teetering, I should say, being challenged. It seems that people are in agitation, fearful of both sides of the aisle, or fearful of the other side of the aisle. And the church is caught somewhere in the middle of all this. What do we do? People fearful they'll lose their jobs if they don't get vaccinated, that somehow that things are going to just implode on us. What I believe is the lie that we are being told is that God cannot be trusted to carry you through. I believe the lie is that God has left us here, abandoned us almost to deal with this on our own. I believe the lie is that our God does not have a good plan for you. I believe the lie is that our God is not all powerful to carry us through. What I also believe is this is a test for the church. Do we truly believe that our God is able to take us through? Because if this is it, and some people actually believe this is culminating in the mark of the beast soon, and we're gonna see it. It's gonna be passed. You're gonna be forced to. You won't be able to buy or sell, and it's gonna get into a place where ultimately you're gonna be killed if you don't do this. Is that what God is saying to us? And if that is what God is saying to us, does God not have the power to take you through? They didn't believe it. Their enemy was bigger than their fear, than their God. The story is very clear what takes place. The people decide, they say, all right, they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. We should go back to bondage, is what they said. We're right in a place right now where we can choose to go forward, or we can choose to stay in fear. Who's going to lead you? Who's going to follow you? I want to state this very clearly for the record, because the Bible is very clear on this. When it all comes down to the end, no matter what side you believe is the right side, they're all going to join together to persecute God's people. No matter how you look at this, somehow they're going to find a way to get together. And we look at this now and go, this is not possible in our nation. But Revelation is very clear. Revelation 13 is very clear. This nation is going to lead the charge. And we look around and say, wait a minute, China's going to do this because they're getting so big, and this is what's being brought to us. But the truth of the matter is we don't know the future, but we live in the fear of the future. And that's where they live too. They were fearful that their God could not sustain them through the future. They were fearful that God could not bring them into the promised land. They were fearful that somehow he was going to abandon them. And so they wept and they cried and they cursed Moses. Look at the story. I mean, it's pretty interesting. If you go down to chapter 14 and you look at verse 10, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Thou shalt not kill. Seriously? Let's stone them. Why? Because what they said doesn't match with what I believe. This is exactly what's taking place in our world today. Let's kill those, basically. Let's cancel them. Let's end up putting them out of business. Let us just basically be done with those who do not believe or act or do what we want them to do. We're fighting each other in ways that says a nation that was formed to bring the glory of God to the planet, basically a nation that has been blessed by God, and we are denying God, we are denying his power, his existence, we are turning against him, and we as a nation are ultimately standing just before God because we have turned our face from him. So the world we're in right now, friends, is based on what we as a people are doing. Beautiful part about the story is the glory of the God appears. God intervenes. God steps in. God promises that before it's all done, he's going to do the exact same thing here. If your faith is weak because you're worried about what's going on in the world around us, God's promise is that his glory will still be seen. Revelation chapter 18 is very clear. This world will be lighted up with God's glory. Not your glory, not a president's glory, not a party's glory. It's going to be lighted up with God's glory. God's glory will be seen in this entire planet somehow, some way, but it will only be seen through those who believe. There were people who will deny it. The majority denied it. Only 2 stood faithful. Right now, you have a choice. We have a choice. We're looking at commandments that deal with our relationship with God, but it also deals with our relationship with each other. The last commandment that we want to look at here for a moment is thou shalt not steal. How does this work? Well, when you listen to or you look at what's going on in this story here, right now, these people who are lying about what God is planning to do are stealing the inheritance away from those people who could have gone into the promised land. They didn't go. They lied to them. They told them that God could not bring them through. They told them the difficulties were stronger than their God. They told them the difficulties were more powerful than their God, and they believed it. And in denying God's power, they lied to the people and they stole their inheritance. We are living in a time, friends, where we need to take our eyes of what's going off around us in the political sphere, in the entertainment sphere, in the moral sphere that's corrupted around us, and put our eyes back onto God. And as we look back to him, let him lead you, let him guide you. We don't need to live in fear. We need to stand strong. Caleb and Joshua stand strong. Moses stands strong. And God delivers them through this. The sad part is, for the people who did not believe, it was too late. By the time they turned around and said, yes, now we will believe, now we will accept, now we will follow, it was too late. There's going to come a time on this earth, probation will close. There's going to come a time on this earth where we are going to have one last opportunity to share God's word, one last opportunity to believe God's word. My challenge to us as a church, as we close, our challenge to us is to believe that God is more powerful than anything you face out there. Stay with him, because the lie will ultimately take you away from him. Don't get caught up in things that are not of eternal value. There was a whole nation of people that believed a lie. In the end, there's going to be a whole world, a whole planet of people that are going to believe a lie. What you believe today is going to be based on your relationship with God today. You don't need to be fearful of what's going on, because it doesn't matter, because God is in control today. Moses and Aaron fall down on their face in the assembly of the people, and they plead for God's mercy. This is where we need to be as a church right now. On our face, pleading for God to help us. On our knees, pleading for God to help our nation, to help our planet, to lead and guide us through the crisis we're in. If God's not going to do it, who will?